Okay, call the meeting to order. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you all for attending tonight. Will the city clerk please do the roll?
There are 6 council members present, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Brianna Duran is on the phone, and Councilmember Specker is absent.
Thank you. Okay, action on approve the agenda. Entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Avery,
Aye.
Doran,
Aye.
Niemeyer,
Aye.
Rasmussen,
Aye.
Tiltonburn,
Aye.
Wendell.
Aye.
All right, we get to move on. Open forum. Is there any member of the public who wishes to address the council on an item not listed on tonight's agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. Item 5, the reason why we're here this evening, discussion on IM 28, prohibiting taxes on anything sold for human consumption. Just so you all know, tonight's video will be available first thing tomorrow morning, so if you want to watch it again or let everybody else that missed it, that it will be available. All right, from there, Paul Brusino, our city manager, will present this item.
Thank you, Mayor, City Council members, Mayor. This item was brought forward at a request by the City Council as an opportunity to inform the public on IM 28. This, of course, is a ballot measured for November 5th on prohibiting certain taxes on consumables. For the presentation tonight, we have Rick Weiland, the sponsor of IM 28, Nathan Sanderson, Executive Director of the South Dakota Retailers Association, Sarah Rankin, Executive Director of the League of Municipalities, Tim Reed, District 7 Senator, and Stephanie Mason, Vice President of Economic Development and Operations, and there might be a few other people that want to speak to the item. So with that said, would probably turn it over to Rick to go ahead and present his items to the council and to the public pertaining to the sponsorship of IM 28, and then we'll transfer it over to Nathan to speak to the items.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Paul, and the council for giving me an opportunity to tell you our side of the story. There's always two sides to a story. You've probably heard a lot from the other side, and I'm going to try to address some of those issues that have been raised. But first of all, IM 28 simply removes the state's sales tax on food, okay? And that would be at this juncture 4.2%. We went through the process every time you do, working with the various state agencies that you need to deal with, including the Legislative Research Council, which is a bipartisan or nonpartisan entity that's there to support both the legislature and citizens. IM 28 is about providing relief to people that need it most, and I just want to reference that Feeding South Dakota, which is the largest hunger relief organization in our state, they have a footprint throughout the country, but recently just updated their research and said that there were over 106,000 South Dakotans that they classified as food insecure, which means they don't know where their next meal is coming from. That's more than 10% of our population. 1 out of 6 of them are kids. And families that aren't on, food stamps, but are in that gap, end up spending upwards of 30% of their income just to buy groceries, just to put food on the table to feed their kids. It is a regressive and I think immoral tax, and disproportionately affects the most vulnerable in our society. South Dakota is one of 2 states that still collects the full state tax on food, the other state being Mississippi. We've been fighting this issue. When I say we, the collective, it's been ongoing for 20 years in the state legislature. Every now and then maybe they'll get the House to pass it or the Senate to pass it, but it never seems to get out of either chamber at the same time into the governor's office, for a signature, which is why we have the initiative process. And I'm going to give you just a little brief history. I mean, this is something that the citizens can do when the legislature isn't doing what they want them to do. And we've been using citizen initiatives since 1898, if you can believe that. And I've been involved with a lot of them since 2014, including minimum wage, Medicaid expansion, payday lending, and now we're working on this. 66.4% of South Dakotans, according to the Newswatch poll conducted by the Cheeseman Democracy Center at Vermillion, determined that there was overwhelming support. 66.4% of South Dakotans want this tax repealed. In fact, if you'll recall, when Governor Noem was running for governor for her reelection in the fall of 2022, had been opposed throughout her career against doing anything with the state's tax on food. But she did a 180, and she said it was the right time and the right thing to do. We were rooting for her. I don't agree with the governor on much, but at this issue, I was in full agreement and hoping that she was going to be able to get this done legislatively. Even with a 94-11 split, Republican-Democrat, she wasn't able to get it done. So we went into the streets with a petition and collected over 25,000 signatures, and were approved. We had a validity rate of almost 89%. It was approved, and it will be on the ballot this November. I want to just, because I know there's a lot of confusion, and you're getting lots of information, and I think most of it is disinformation, but people believe what they want to believe. I wanted to read the petition to you, if I can find it, where it specifically says that this is a tax on groceries, on food. And the argument is, well, consumables, what are those? And we're going to hear from Nathan and others about their interpretation of that. But the actual petition talks about what gets taxed in one sentence. And in the last sentence, it says municipalities can continue to collect the tax. And you're hearing that you're not going to be able to if it passes. I'm here to tell you it's just not true. The official record, the official position of the state of South Dakota will be on the ballot. And it will say it's going to cost or save, our interpretation, the taxpayers, $123.9 million. That estimation was based on taking the state's tax off of food, not gasoline, not toilet paper, not pharmaceuticals, not services, food. And in the bottom of that fiscal note, it restates what was on the petition. Municipalities can continue to collect the tax. So there's a lot of noise out there about how hard this is going to be for a city like Brookings, that you're going to lose your ability to tax food. That's just simply not the case. Now, I don't know what you want to believe or who you're going to believe, but when the voters go into the voting booth, you know what they're going to see? They're going to see that fiscal note, and they're going to see the Attorney General's explanation. And the Attorney General, by omission, does not say anything about municipalities. It's all about what would happen at the state level. He also, Marty Jackley, also makes some reference, but he uses hypotheticals. May affect the tobacco settlement, or may be in conflict with the streamlined sales tax agreement. But when an initiative law is passed by the voters, it supersedes all the existing laws on the books. It becomes the law. It has statutory authority, okay? And I know there is a publication that the Municipal League put out the other day and sent to everybody and itemized how much you were going to lose if this thing passes. I know there's also another publication that was done by the Legislative Appropriations Committee asking the LRC to come up with some new fiscal analysis, okay? And that fiscal analysis not only included the tax on food, but it was everything else I referenced, from services to gasoline to pharmaceuticals. And I'll tell you right now, they have it listed. Services, $335 million. Energy, $91 million. Tobacco, $42 million. Personal care, $17 million. Paper and stationery, $15 million. And other consumables, $19 million, which adds up to $646 million. That was not what was on the fiscal note. That fiscal note was focused on taking the state's tax off of food, and that's what the voters are going to see when they go into the ballot. So to use what I think are a bunch of, scare tactics, and I'll tell you the biggest tell from the opposition is they call themselves South Dakotans Against the State Income Tax. That's what they've named their committee. Well, think about that, okay? In this state, do you think a state income tax would ever be a viable option? That the legislature, which is made up of 94 Republicans and 11 Democrats, it may change a vote or two here over time, but that the legislature is going to become a champion for a state income tax? It's never going to happen because it isn't what the voters want. They'll never support it. And I know Nathan will say, well, it could be done with a ballot initiative. Well, I can't imagine an organization, we do ballot initiatives, would ever want to take that on because it's a non-starter. So you can't scare people by saying this is going to cause a state income tax. And you shouldn't be misinforming people that this is going to be a $646 million hit on the state budget when it's not. Jackley indicates in there may require or will require legislative and judicial clarity. You know, there's something called legislative intent. We have a legislator in here tonight I met. You know, when a bill gets like sort of confusing and it ends up in the court, the Supreme Court of the South Dakota looks at legislative intent. Well, the legislators in this case are the voters of the state of South Dakota. And their intent, by signing the petition, by reading the two-sentence initiated law and the fiscal note, signed this not because they wanted to take the tax off of tobacco or gasoline or toilet paper or pharmaceuticals. It's because the $123 million is the tax that would come off of food, the state tax on food. So, you know, I don't know much time, and I go on, but I can tell you that just recently, both the Secretary of State's office and the LRC reconfirmed. The Secretary of State's office said something to the, and I'll paraphrase, you can't change what's being taxed. You know, you can suggest that there may be problems with it, but those are the hypotheticals, right? That's not what the state weighed in on when they did the fiscal note. And the head of the Legislative Research Council reaffirmed that municipalities will still be able to collect this tax. And, you know, I don't know what else to tell you. If you don't believe what I'm saying, you can always go to the Secretary of State's website and pull down all these documents. They're there. So just think about this. Here, we're in Brookings, South Dakota, home of the Jackrabbits, right? And I'm a Coyote, but I should have probably said that I lost all your support. But, you know, next time you're in the grocery line, you know, in your checking out, just look around you. You know, are there students there buying groceries and paying a tax that no other state's forcing them to pay? You know, are there people there that look like they could use a little bit of a break? I mean, I'm not a bleeding heart. I'm really not. I believe in fiscal responsibility. I think this is super responsible. And I know we may have a discussion tonight how we're going to pay for it. I'm more than willing to try to weigh in that. But just understand when you draft one of these, you've got to be very careful you don't mix up and put in two subjects because they've been able to kick things out after the voters have approved them. So you stay focused on what you need to focus on. Our focus has always been this is a bad tax. It's time to get rid of it. Even Governor Noem's Chief Bureau of Finance Officer, Jim Twilliger, said we can afford this even with the most conservative projections. We can afford to pay for this. So I've said my piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiland.
Yeah.
I said thank you.
Oh,
Before we move on to the next speaker, I think I'd like to have all 5 of the people that are going to speak this evening speak, and then we'll have public questions and comments, and then council will weigh in after that. I guess I should have threw out the decorum a little bit before that. So Paul will announce the next speaker.
Yes, I believe we have Nathan speaking next with the Retailer Association of South Dakota.
Good evening. I'm Nathan Sanderson. I'm the Executive Director of the South Dakota Retailers Association, and I'm working with a coalition of now almost 50 different South Dakota organizations that are opposed to initiated Measure 28. To start with, I want to read the measure because we haven't heard the language of the measure yet. It's just 2 sentences. It's pretty brief. It says, notwithstanding any other provision of law, the state may not tax the sale of anything sold for human consumption, except alcoholic beverages and prepared food. Municipalities may continue to impose such taxes. So why is it that 50 different organizations representing agriculture, education, business, chambers, economic development entities are opposed to initiated Measure 28? Well, let me read you the definition of tobacco product in South Dakota law. Definition of tobacco product is any item made of tobacco intended for human consumption, including cigarettes, cigars, pipe tobacco, and smokeless tobacco and vapor products. Let me read you the definition of electronic smoking device. Is any e-cigarette, e-cigar, e-pipe, e-hookah, or vape pen containing or delivering nicotine or any other substance intended for human consumption that may be used by a person in any manner for the purpose of inhaling vapor or aerosol from the product. Finally, let me read you the definition of cannabis product in South Dakota law. Is any concentrated cannabis, cannabis extracts, and products that are infused with cannabis or an extract thereof and are intended for use or consumption by humans. The term includes edible cannabis products, beverages, topical products, ointments, oils, and tinctures. So here we've got an initiated measure that would eliminate the state's ability to tax anything sold for human consumption, except alcohol and prepared food. And now we've got 3 definitions in South Dakota law right now: tobacco products, vaping products, cannabis, that include the phrase intended for human consumption. There's just no way that initiated Measure 28 is solely limited to food. And that's why the Legislative Research Council's fiscal note, Mr. Weiland referenced, is up to $646 million every year in lost sales tax revenues to the state of South Dakota, because it's way more than just food. And you don't just have to take my word for it. Pardon me for a moment, I'm going to read the Attorney General's explanation of IM 28. Okay, just bear with me if you would, it's a couple paragraphs long. It says, an initiated measure prohibiting taxes on anything sold for human consumption. The AG's explanation says, currently the state collects tax on the sale or use of certain goods, including food and drinks. Many municipalities also collect these taxes. This initiated measure prohibits the state from collecting sales or use tax on anything sold for human consumption. This measure eliminates these sources of revenue for the state. Human consumption is not defined by state law. However, its common definition includes more than foods and drinks. The measure does not prohibit the collection of sales or use tax on alcoholic beverages or prepared food. Prepared food is defined by law to include food that's sold heated or with utensils. The measure may affect the state's obligations under the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement and the Streamlined Sales Tax Agreement. The Master Settlement Agreement resulted from multi-state lawsuits against cigarette manufacturers for the public health effects of smoking. South Dakota's annual share of the Master Settlement Agreement is approximately $20 million. The Streamlined Sales Tax Agreement is a multi-state program designed to simplify the collection of sales and use taxes for companies selling in multiple jurisdictions. Judicial or legislative clarification of the measure will be necessary. So this is the Attorney General's statement that you'll see on the ballot. It confirms that the common definition of anything sold for human consumption includes more than foods and drinks. It references, as Mr. Weiland mentioned, that judicial or legislative clarification of the measure will be necessary. The reason that ag organizations like the Pork Producers and the Cattlemen's Association and the Soybean Association and the Farm Bureau and education organizations like the South Dakota Education Association and the Associated School Boards and business organizations like the South Dakota Chamber and the retailers and a whole variety of folks that you can see on there are opposed to this because cutting that much revenue from the state is either going to A, result in huge cuts to things like education, healthcare, and state employees, or B, we're going to have to find another way to make up the revenue. The money's going to come from somewhere. And that's really the thing, is there's no plan in this proposal to replace the lost revenue. We can have a disagreement about how much that is. I think the updated Legislative Research Council figure is at least 133 million, up to 646 million. If you include tobacco in that, it's 176 million. We can pick and choose which ones we want to take out of there. At the end of the day, we're talking about at least $100 million of lost revenue to the state of South Dakota with no way to make it up, because we think that it's going to lead to cuts or higher taxes elsewhere. Our organization's opposed. Stand by for any questions. Thanks.
I believe next is Sarah with the League of Municipalities.
I'm Sarah Rankin, the Executive Director of the South Dakota Municipal League. Thank you for having us this evening. Nate covered a bunch of different reasons why IM28 would be so bad for the state of South Dakota, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how it would impact our municipalities. There's an estimated loss of $51.5 million for municipalities across the state of South Dakota and $1.6 million impact to the city of Brookings. Should the ability to collect sales tax on these items be taken away, cities have no choice but to cut vital services that their residents have become accustomed to and rely on. This financial shortfall would cripple efforts to fix streets, update aging infrastructure, and maintain city facilities such as libraries, swimming pools, and parks, as you all know all too well. The passage of IM28 would place an undue strain on municipal budgets, forcing cities to find alternative revenue sources that may potentially place additional financial pressure on residents already grappling with economic challenges. The proponent continues to argue that the ballot measure clearly states municipalities may continue to collect a sales tax. However, as you heard when Nate read the ballot measure, such taxes, as it reads, is not clearly defined and leaves the door open for misinterpretation and continued opportunity for municipalities to lose their authority to impose the municipal sales tax. Nowhere in the Attorney General's explanation, as you heard, does it state that municipalities are exempt from the impacts of IM28. In fact, again, he stated legislative and judicial clarification would be necessary. Furthermore, the proponents asked the Attorney General to clarify with certainty that municipalities would, in fact, still be able to impose a municipal sales tax, and he did not respond. As the old adage goes, silence speaks louder than words. 10-52-2 states that no tax may be levied on items unless such tax conforms in all respects to the state tax on such items with the exception of the rate. Until it is 100% certain that municipalities are safeguarded from the negative impacts of IM28, the Municipal League will continue to oppose this measure on behalf of our members. The proponents had several opportunities to ensure that municipalities would be held without harm with the passage of IM28. However, they failed to take advantage of those opportunities. Not once was the Municipal League approached when writing the ballot measure to provide input to make these assurances. In addition, the proponents ignored recommended language from LRC that would have safeguarded the municipalities in the state of South Dakota. Although it may not have been the intent, this measure was poorly written and leaves municipalities facing very real and potentially devastating impacts to their budgets and your local communities. 75 of your fellow municipalities have passed a resolution showing their opposition of IM28, and we would ask that you do the same. Thank you.
I believe our very own Tim Reed is next.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. Tim Reed. I serve as your state senator for District 7. I've spent 8 years in the legislature. I served all 8 years on the local government committee that had been in the legislature, and I spent the past 2 years as chair of the Senate local government committee. I also served 2 years on taxation committee, and I'm the past president of the Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board, and that's going to come into play here as I discuss this initiated measure with you. First thing I want to talk about, we're getting a little wonkish here, but this is an initiated measure, and you will hear that it can be changed by the legislature, and that is true. That is true. That is something that the legislature can do. After this is passed, they can go ahead during the session and make changes to it. But you have to realize that any increase in taxes or any new taxes requires a 2/3 approval by the body. So both bodies have to approve it with a 2/3 majority vote. So if any changes that the legislature makes is deemed as being an increase. So, an example would be, this is, if we take a look at its human consumption. And so now the judgment is that we have taken taxes on other items and we're actually raising them. And so it could be ruled that it needs a 2/3 vote. And that can be a very high hurdle to pass. The other thing is, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about the AG's explanation. And I think it is very important to note, in here, what we're getting to is he says judicial or legislative clarification of the measure will be necessary. And the first thing is, what is human consumption of goods? Human consumption is not defined by state law. Now, that's where we're going to get into some issues with this. If we have to start to decide what is actually going to be under human consumable, that could again trigger the whole idea of the 2/3 having to make any changes. Also, it may affect the state's obligation of the streamlined sales tax agreement. And the streamlined sales tax agreement was put in place to help the state and municipalities collect sales tax on remote sales. So you see all those packages, UPS delivering those packages, that's ensuring that the cities have the ability to collect that sales tax. And I think during COVID and the changes that happened there, think if you didn't have that revenue for your city budget. Now, the Streamlined Sales Tax organization was started so businesses would have an ease of collecting those taxes, and that's what it's all about. So and I can go directly, and a lot of people argue about this, but I can show you directly with Streamlined Sales Tax in Chapter 10, which is all the sales tax. It makes a comment that unless such tax conforms in all respects to the state tax on such items, with the exception of the rate. The problem is, this just says you cannot tax it at the state level, right? If you're taxing it at the state level, what the streamline agreement says, you also have to tax it at the local level. Now, it does say exception of the rate. And so that's what we would do, and I'll talk about House Bill 1075 that actually took care of that issue. So if no change is accomplished to this, cities may not be able to tax food and human consumables. I know they said that, well, states right here, that it says municipalities may continue to impose such taxes, but that will be left up to judicial review and the legislature, and that could be problematic. And then being out of compliance with the master agreement from Streamline causes issues with the collection of remote sales tax. You do not want that to happen. That is a very important revenue source for the cities. Now, Mr. Weiland talked about other attempts that have been made, and I think a very good example of that is House Bill 1075 that was in the 2023 legislative session. And what happened with this bill, although this was defeated, it was an agreement that we would just lower sales tax in general. In that bill, it's very specific. First of all, it defines what food and food ingredients are. Any substance, whether in liquid, concentrated, solid, frozen, dried, or dehydrated form, that is sold for ingestion or chewing by humans and is consumed for taste or nutritional value. The term food does not include any, and it goes through and talks about alcohol, tobacco, cigarettes, cannabis, and prepared food. It goes on to define exactly what prepared food is. Okay? So the change that was made or was requested in this bill states the rate of tax imposed by this chapter on retailers upon the gross receipts of all sales of food and food ingredients as defined in 1045-1 is 0%. That keeps us out of conflict with the Streamlined Sales Tax Master Agreement because you're just varying the rate. I think bottom line on this is legislative and judicial review also opens a can of worms that could still lead to large reductions in cities' sales tax collection. So I think you've got to be very careful with this initiated measure and how it could affect your revenue streams. Thank you.
We're going to let everybody have their say first, okay? And then if there's questions on it, you can answer the questions, sir.
I believe Stephanie is the next presenter.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council members. Stephanie Mason with Brookings Economic Development Corporation. First, I just wanted to thank you for taking time to learn about this important issue and making this information available to the public. I'm here today to share a message really in partnership with both Brookings Economic Development Corporation and our local Chamber of Commerce, as a lot of the key points that we want to make align. Thought we'd save you a little bit of time. We believe the potential consequences of the initiated measure of IM 28 warrant some significant concern for our community. While the measure's intent may be well-meaning, its far-reaching implications for both our state of South Dakota and our municipalities, like Brookings, are quite alarming. As you're likely aware and have heard tonight, IM 28 would prohibit South Dakota from collecting taxes on most products that are sold for human consumption. This includes everything from tobacco to toilet paper, resulting in a projected 46.5% reduction in sales tax revenue for the state. Such a loss would create millions of dollars in a gap in the state budget and severely impact our education and our health services, especially for our vulnerable populations. Additionally, municipalities like Brookings would face millions in loss of revenue annually, forcing cuts to essential services such as our law enforcement, road maintenance, and our parks. Tribal governments would also experience reduced funding from existing sales tax compacts with the state. And ultimately, this would leave South Dakota with the difficult choice of either imposing difficult cuts to our critical services or raising taxes elsewhere to make up for that lost revenue. It's for these reasons and more that BEDC, the Chamber of Commerce for Brookings, stand alongside our Economic Development Association of South Dakota, the Municipal League of Cities, the Retailers Association of South Dakota, our State Chamber of Commerce, and others that are urging a no on IM 28. Again, I want to thank you guys for your time and your commitment to our city's well-being.
Okay, thank you. So we really didn't come up with a decorum here on the question and answers, but I think if somebody has a question and wants to direct it to one of the 5 speakers for information, I think that's the route we'll go. So we'll open it up for public comment and questions. Okay, close public hearing on that. Council have any questions, comments? Councilmember Wendell.
Thank you, Mayor. And I have a handful of questions, so if another counselor wants to jump in, feel free to do that. I don't need to monopolize our time, but I just had a couple of questions I wanted to clarify, and I felt like multiple speakers addressed this, but I wanted to make sure for folks following along at home or those with us tonight, there was real clarity on what might happen next if IM 28 was passed. I think both Nathan and Rick referenced potential legislative or judicial action to clarify some of the questions that are lingering. The questions that seem to be most pertinent, I think, for a community like ours are whether or not municipalities can continue to collect this tax and the definition of consumables. And so I just wanted to ensure that it was very clear, if IM 28 passes, is it likely that there will be legislative action to answer those 2 questions and judicial action, or is it one branch or the other is going to do the work of answering those 2 questions? And maybe you both want to give us a take on what you see happening if it were to pass.
Well, I would
Please go to the mic first because it's being recorded, and I can't hear you until you get to the mic.
I would argue that there isn't going to need to be, and let me just point out in the Attorney General's explanation, I think Nathan went by this too quickly, but it says currently the state collects tax on the sale of use of certain goods, including food, drinks, and many municipalities also collect these taxes. Here's the real critical sentence. This initiative measure prohibits the state from collecting sales or use tax on anything sold for human consumption. This measure eliminates these sources of revenue for the state. And I think if there's any judicial clarification, they'll look at what the Attorney General wrote and they'll come to the same conclusion the LRC did. Now, the whole consumable argument that's out there, if it gets to that point where someone's suing because they want the tax off of toilet paper because it's a consumable, the legislative intent, as I said, the voters are the legislature. What was their intent when they signed the petition to put this on the ballot? What did the fiscal note say? It wasn't taking the tax off of tobacco or the tax off of paper or the tax off of services, $390-some million. No, it was taking the state's tax off of food. And that's what you'll see. And I'm glad they raised this, because if there are some tweaks that need to be made, they can be made at the legislative level. We don't think they're going to be necessary. And I think all these are hypotheticals. If you look at what's going to be on your ballot when you're going to vote, that's the official position of the state of South Dakota, and it's based on facts, not hypotheticals.
Thank you. Nathan, do you have comments?
If initiated Measure 28 were to pass, I think you'd see both of those things, judicial and legislatively, happening concurrently. I think that there would be some type of lawsuit to find out what exactly we mean here. And then, of course, the legislature convenes in the second week of January, and I'm certain that there would be action to be taken. To Senator Reed's point, part of the concern that we have is exactly what would the remedy be legislatively? What does IM28 do? It eliminates the state's ability to impose a tax, right? And so, as Senator Reed referenced, the legislative threshold to increase a fee or to add, or tax or add a new tax or fee is 2/3. And so if the people remove a tax, in order for the legislature to quote unquote fix it, to make the state whole, they're going to have to increase a tax. That's going to take a 2/3 vote of the legislature. Or they're going to make cuts. And so I think you're going to see, if this were to pass, the legislature would take action related to what do we do to backfill the dollars. But if they're unlikely to pass a tax increase, then they're going to look for cuts on top of whatever the governor's budget is. And then they're going to look for clarification related to the language, I think in concurrence with judicial action.
I have a couple more questions.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think my next question is probably for Mr. Weiland. In Brookings, obviously, like any municipality in the state, as we think about potential projected losses tied to the passage of IM28, we think about a potential $1.6 million loss in revenue for the city and have some concerns about that. But I do think there are potential broader implications for a community like ours. Nearly 25% of our workforce are state employees, either associated with colleges, universities, working in the public sector in our schools, or other government agencies, or for the city of Brookings. And so when I think about impacts not just to the municipality, but also potential cuts that could hit education and other public sectors, I think it could have a broader impact on workers in Brookings who are employed in those sectors. I realize as you drafted the petition, you had a pretty narrow focus on the intent. Did you also contemplate what some of the solutions might be for that lost revenue, and think about what some of, what a repeal of the grocery tax in layman's terms might trigger, and what some of those solutions might be for the public sector?
Well, like I said, we have a single subject rule, so you really couldn't mix that up. But I've thought about it. If I were in the legislature, I would have voted with Governor Noem on her food tax cut. Instead, the legislature opted to cut sales tax by 0.3% across the board, which I understand was about $100 million. But because of Governor Noem, they didn't make that permanent, okay? That's been sunsetted. So there's a potential option right there down the road. I think it's 2027. The other thing that you could look at, and I know there was this internet sales tax, they call it the Wayfair tax, where we weren't, remote sellers, remote retailers weren't all charging a sales tax, but some were. But when that lawsuit went forward and the state was successful, that bumped up like another $50 to $60 million in addition to what was already being collected. So that's something you could look at. I mean, if there's a will, there's a way. And the third thing I would look at would be that right now there's $1.4 billion in sales tax exemptions in the 2025 budget. It seems like anybody that's got an association with membership and can hire a lobbyist and they can go to peer, they can get something for their members. I keep wondering about who's out there lobbying for the families that are spending upwards of 30% of their household income just to feed themselves, or the students here at SDSU that are having to buy groceries. Like I said, every state, 48 of them have done something. They've either gotten rid of it, or they've reduced it, or they've created some kind of rebate program, but not South Dakota. And, you know, I just think she was right. It's the right time. It's the right thing to do. So if there's a will, there's a way. This can be done. Do you have a follow-up?
One more?
You have noted a couple of times, or I think there's been some different interpretations of whether or not municipalities can continue to implement a tax even if the state passes IM 28 and repeals the tax. I guess that kind of begs the question, if a city like Brookings chose to continue implementing this tax, and cities all over the state choose to do that, how does that help grocery shoppers in Brookings?
You know, this, I goes, the city of Brookings could decide not to do it if that's what they wanted to do, but they're not being forced by the state. Sure. It's a decision you could make on your own. You could decide not to have a food tax. Sure. In your municipality. There's no prohibition to doing that.
It just seems
what the legislation does, or what this initiated law would do, it's focused at the state level. It's that 4.2% that they charge for food.
I just wanted to make sure I understood that piece of the argument correctly. It just seems to me that if one of the responses is that municipalities can continue to impose a tax, I'm not sure for the consumer that ends up benefiting them if we're replacing lost revenue from the state with a local level tax.
Yeah, but they're still paying the state share, the 4.2%. So they're getting that break,
Sure.
right? So you charge 2%? You can charge up to 2%?
Okay.
Well, the state share is 4.2%, or 4.2%. That goes away.
Sure.
That's the break the worker gets, what the student gets, what the family that's trying to, you know, feed their kids get.
Nick, you have any other questions?
Good questions.
Council members, do you have any questions? Councilmember Duran, do you have any questions?
No, mine were covered. Thank you.
Okay. Andrew?
Thank you. I've just got two. I was just curious, are there any numbers on what the dollar amount saved per individual, per family, whatever metric you want to use on that, would save per year on groceries if this passes in November?
I've seen numbers, but on the average, it's about a month's worth of groceries for a family of four. $500-600.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. Next one's kind of a process question for me, kind of along the lines of Councilor Wendell's questions, probably directed to Steve. Requires two hypotheticals. This passes in November, and the city decides we want to do or want to continue our sales tax on groceries. What does that process look like? Does it automatically remain in place, or are we gonna, as a city council, need to pass that? Does it go back to voters? What is that 2% if we chose to add that back on? How does that happen?
I think our ordinance would be self-actuating or continue as it has in the past. So there wouldn't be any formal action that we would need. There's always the possibility, I suppose, of clarification if we get some guidance from the state or Attorney General as to the impacts of the initiated measure that we're not aware of. But generally speaking, our 2% would continue.
Okay. I do have a question, and it's probably directed towards Senator Reed. If IM 28 does actually get passed, And it goes into effect next July 1st, correct? And with that, a follow-up question, if there is legislative and judicial action being done and it's not completed by the 1st of July, does it still go in effect?
Mr. Mayor, council members, yes, it would go into effect July 1st, and that if there was any legislative changes to that, then they would be enacted on July 1st also. If it goes into any kind of judicial process, a lot could happen there. There could be a stay on the law. They could just say, we're gonna stop the law from going into effect until we make the decisions on this. I think the issue is if you have both of those going on at the same time, it will be really confusing.
Right, because you may have to have judicial clarification before you guys can do any legislation.
Or it could even go, well, it couldn't go vice versa, but if we don't understand how the law is going to be interpreted, any changes we may make may not be valid in the court's eyes.
Okay. All right. So, sure.
Just a quick, what could also happen is that if the legislature.
Hold your comments until you get to the mic. We're
What
recording.
could also happen, Mr. Mayor, is that it could be referred if so you got three possibilities there. I just wanted to make that known because when the minimum wage was passed in 2014, there were changes by the legislature that exempted young adults from that increase, and that was referred. We have a referendum. We can refer laws or changes to laws to the voters. So what happened in that case is that the law actually went into effect in July 1st, and the wage went up, pending the referral, and the referral was to the next election, which was 2016, and the referral was based on the changes the legislature made, and the voters disapproved those changes, so it just basically stayed in effect from July 1st. Today it's at $10.20 an hour.
Okay. Paul has a couple questions.
Yeah, this question is for the league director, Sarah, if you could. The amount that you mentioned that could potentially impact the city of Brookings is $1.6 million. Knowing that there's varying opinions on what consumable means, is that a conservative amount? Could we expect more or less if this does truly impact the city of Brookings?
That was going off the original 137 million. That did not take into consideration the fiscal note that was issued at the end of July. So it was very conservative.
Thank you. The other question I had was for Rick. Rick, I was surprised to see this quote, and I haven't seen it yet. And it's regarding the quote from Twilliger. It says, even with conservative projections for future revenue growth, we can afford this tax cut by Twilliger. Was that on specifically IM28, or was that by prior measures that they were talking about?
That was during the debate on the governor's bill. I think he made that comment sometime in January of 2023.
So that wasn't on consumables, that was on?
No, that was on the food tax.
Thank you.
Okay. No other comments, questions from council? All right, we'll move on. Is there any member in the council that has any items for a future agenda item? Okay, we'll go on. Next meeting next week is on the 24th. Budget study session number 2. Jake will introduce a CIP and consolidated fee schedule. And then we have a couple items on the consent agenda. One's temporary alcohol permit from Sodexo, presentation from Students Association, 2 bid awards for concrete project and Parks Trail project. First reading on modifying speed zones within the city limits. And then we have 3 second readings, rezoning hearing process submitted to due to submitted petition, conditional use permit, and reasonable accommodations ordinance. That being said, and then we'll also have a progress report from the Assistant City Manager. And from that, I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
If I can, just one thing, real quick, and I don't mean to take any more time. It is International IT Day. And I want to thank publicly Don and Kwaku. They never get recognized. They're the reason why this program is on the air for the public to view, which I'm sure there's plenty of people watching. So thank you, Don and Kwaku.
All right. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign.